Welcome, dear listeners, to a place where the winds carry whispers and the night holds stories untold. Tonight, we venture into a realm of mystery, where the lines between dreams and reality blur, and the magic of the garden awaits. Close your eyes, let the soft rustling of the leaves calm your mind, and allow the soothing tones of the night to lull you into serenity. Let your imagination wander as we journey together, deeper into the heart of the witch's garden, a place where stories come to life, and sleep is but a breath away. The village of Briar's Hollow had always been quiet, nestled under the shadow of the ancient forest that bordered its edge. On most days, the wind swept through with nothing but the usual rustling of leaves, stirring only whispers of the ordinary. But tonight, the wind was different. Morgathra stood at the edge of the village, where the cobblestone paths gave way to wild, untamed woods. She had heard it again, her name carried on the wind, soft as a sigh, yet unmistakable. The villagers would never believe her if she told them. They were afraid of what lay beyond the trees, afraid of the secrets whispered by the wind in the dead of night. But Morgathra had always been different. While others turned away from the forest's dark, looming presence, she was drawn to it, like a moth to flame. The night was deepening, the sky a tapestry of ink and scattered stars. A crescent moon hung low, its pale light casting long shadows that flickered like spectres on the forest's edge. Morgathra took a breath, her heart beating a steady rhythm in her chest, and stepped forward. Each footfall seemed to echo in the stillness, as if the earth itself was holding its breath, watching her. The wind stirred again, this time stronger, swirling around her like invisible fingers, teasing at her dark curls. And then she heard it, soft yet clear. Morgathra. It was a voice, a whisper wrapped in the breath of the night, beckoning her, urging her deeper into the trees. She paused, hesitating for a moment as doubt crept in. The villagers' warnings echoed in her mind, tales of those who had entered the forest and never returned, of dark magic that lurked beyond the safety of the village. But beneath her apprehension was a pull, something deeper, something she couldn't ignore. The voice was calling her for a reason, and Morgathra had never been one to shy away from the unknown. Her feet carried her forward before her mind could catch up. The trees seemed to close in around her, their gnarled branches twisting like skeletal fingers overhead. The further she ventured, the more the village behind her faded into memory, until it was nothing more than a distant thought, swallowed by the darkness of the forest. The wind whispered again, but this time it wasn't her name. It was something else, something older, words she couldn't understand, yet they stirred a feeling deep within her. The air around her thickened, the cold biting at her skin, but she pressed on, driven by a force she could neither see nor explain. After what felt like an eternity, The path before her began to change. The ground, once littered with fallen leaves and tangled roots, now seemed almost intentional. Stones appeared beneath her feet, weathered and worn, but arranged in a way that suggested this place had once been known, once walked by others before her. The realization sent a shiver down her spine. Suddenly, the wind fell silent, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Morgathra stopped, her pulse quickening as her eyes adjusted to the dim light. There in the distance, she saw it, a faint glow, barely visible through the trees, like a beacon calling her forward. She took a step closer, and then another, her curiosity burning brighter with every pace. As she approached, the glow grew stronger, revealing the outline of something tall and dark. A gate, twisted and wrought with vines, loomed before her, ancient and foreboding. The iron bars were wrapped in ivy that pulsed faintly, as if alive, moving ever so slightly under the moonlight. Morgathra reached out a hand, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold metal. The moment she touched it, the gate creaked open with a groan, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Beyond the gate, the air was different, heavier, filled with a strange, intoxicating energy. The garden stretched before her, vast and mysterious, its plants glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. There was no sound but the gentle rustle of leaves, as if the plants themselves were whispering secrets too ancient for human ears. And as Morgathra stepped inside, she felt it. The undeniable sense that she had crossed a threshold, not just into a garden, but into something far deeper, something far older. The wind began to stir again, a soft murmur of voices, telling stories she had yet to understand. But she would, soon. The witch's garden had begun to reveal itself. The scene is set, shrouded in the eerie and ethereal, where the wind's whispers and the ancient path lead Morgathra into a realm not bound by time. The garden unfolded before Morgathra like a dream woven from shadows and moonlight. Twisting vines and blooming flowers, none of which she had ever seen before, seemed to pulse with their own light. Colours shifted, impossible shades of violet, silver, and midnight blue. The air was thick with the perfume of strange blossoms, both sweet and intoxicating, lulling her deeper into the hidden realm. The gate behind her clanged shut with a finality that echoed through the stillness, and yet Morgathra felt no fear. There was something about this place, something that felt ancient but familiar, as if she had always been meant to find it. She took a deep breath, the cool air sharp with the scent of earth and magic, and began to walk forward. The path was narrow, lined with thick bushes that bristled with dark, thorny branches. Each step seemed to pull her further into the unknown, but the strange, shifting light from the plants illuminated her way. The trees here were unlike any she had seen before, their bark smooth and black as onyx. their leaves shimmering like silver in the faint moonlight that barely filtered through. They bent toward her as if curious, their branches whispering to one another in a language she could not understand. Morgathra's feet moved almost of their own accord, guided by an unseen force, and with every step the path beneath her became more defined, as though the garden itself was shaping it for her. The further she ventured, the more she felt the weight of the garden's history pressing in on her. Ancient stories woven into the very soil beneath her feet. It wasn't long before she began to notice the whispers. At first, they were soft, barely audible over the sound of her own breathing. But as she walked deeper, they grew louder, though no clearer. The voices seemed to come from the plants themselves, carried on the breeze. But the words were in a language she didn't know, yet somehow understood. It was as though they were telling stories, fragments of lives long gone, of souls entwined with the magic that filled the air. Suddenly, the path curved sharply, leading her toward a towering archway formed entirely of vines and ivy. The ivy here moved ever so slightly, as if alive. Its deep green leaves glistened in the dim light, but there was something about it that made Morgathra hesitate. The air around it felt heavy, as if the vines were holding something back, or perhaps keeping something inside. She took a step closer, her heart beating faster, her breath shallow. The whispers grew louder here, the voices layered, overlapping, as if many were speaking at once. Morgathra could feel the weight of their stories pressing against her mind, begging to be heard. With a trembling hand, she reached out and brushed her fingers against the thick ivy. The moment she made contact, the vines shuddered and began to move, parting slowly to reveal the way forward. Morgathra gasped softly, her eyes widening as the path beyond was revealed. A narrow corridor, flanked by towering plants with dark, velvety leaves. At the end of the corridor, barely visible in the dim light, was a soft, pulsing glow. The glow called to her, just as the wind had earlier. Morgathra felt a tug deep within her chest, a pull she couldn't resist. She stepped through the archway, the ivy closing behind her with a soft hiss, as though sealing her fate. The path here felt more enclosed, more intimate, as if the garden itself was drawing her closer to its heart. The plants around her shifted as she passed, their leaves brushing against her skin like ghostly fingers. The whispers were clearer now, though still just out of reach, their meaning elusive. Morgathra couldn't shake the feeling that they were trying to tell her something important, something she needed to understand. As she walked, the glow at the end of the path grew brighter, casting long, strange shadows on the ground. The air grew cooler, almost damp, and the scent of the flowers became more intense, almost overwhelming. Morgathra's head swam with the fragrance, her thoughts becoming hazy as she neared the source of the light. And then she saw it. At the center of a small clearing, surrounded by plants that seemed to hum with energy, stood a tall wrought iron gate. It was ancient, the metal twisted and knotted with vines that pulsed with the same faint glow. The gate was old, far older than the village, older than the forest itself, and beyond it, something shimmered in the darkness, something waiting to be revealed. Morgathra stepped closer, her breath catching in her throat. The whispers were loud now, almost deafening, filling her mind with fragments of forgotten stories. She reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from the gate, feeling the hum of magic thrumming through the air. And then, with a soft creak, the gate began to open. The hidden path has revealed its secrets to Morgathra, leading her deeper into a realm where the whispers of the past come alive, and the garden's mysteries begin to unfold. The gate opened slowly, as if it had not been disturbed for centuries. Morgathra watched in quiet awe as the iron groaned, its vines pulling away like serpents releasing their prey. The glow she had followed so faithfully now flickered and danced before her, illuminating a world just beyond the threshold. For a moment, Morgathra hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. There was something about the gate, something ancient and knowing. It seemed to pulse with life, as though the very metal was infused with the breath of the earth itself. She could feel the weight of unseen eyes on her, watching, waiting for her next move. A warning whispered through her mind, but it was too late to turn back. The garden had already claimed her curiosity, and the gate beckoned her forward. With a deep breath, she stepped through. On the other side, the world seemed to shift. The air was thick, almost oppressive, filled with the scent of wet earth and something else. Something sweeter, more intoxicating. The plants here were larger, their leaves wide and dark, the edges curling like hands preparing to grasp. They seemed to hum with life, though no breeze stirred their limbs. Everything was still, too still, as though the garden itself was holding its breath. Morgathra's footsteps felt louder than they should in this quiet place. Each one echoed softly, but not against stone or soil. No. It was as though her steps reverberated through the very plants, stirring their hidden voices. She could sense them now, faint but present. A chorus of whispers threading through the air like gossamer. Yet their words were not for her, not yet. Ahead of her, a massive wall of ivy stretched upwards, twisting and tangling around itself in intricate patterns. The vines were thick, their leaves a dark emerald green that glistened in the strange light that filled the space. It was as though the ivy itself was alive, shifting ever so slightly, as if aware of her presence. Morgathra approached cautiously, her fingers itching to touch the strange living wall. As she neared, the ivy began to part, peeling away as though some unseen hand was drawing it back. Behind it, she glimpsed a hidden alcove, barely visible through the remaining tendrils of greenery. A sense of anticipation filled her as the last vine slithered aside, revealing what lay beyond. In the alcove, nestled among the towering plants, stood a single rose bush, its petals as black as night. The rose was like nothing Morgatra had ever seen before. It did not shimmer like the other plants, nor did it hum with the same energy. Instead, it seemed to absorb the light around it, casting the entire alcove into shadow. The darkness that surrounded the rose was thick, tangible, as if it held the weight of something long forgotten. Morgatra felt a chill creep up her spine. There was a story here. She could feel it, waiting to be told. She took a step closer, her gaze fixed on the dark bloom. As she neared, the petals began to unfold, slow and deliberate, as if waking from a deep slumber. With each unfurling petal, the air grew colder, the whispers around her growing louder, more distinct. And then the rose spoke. Its voice was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it filled the space around her. "I once loved," it began, "but love is a fickle thing, as fleeting as the seasons." Morgatra froze, her breath catching in her throat. The voice wasn't like the whispers of the wind or the murmurs of the plants. It was clear, filled with sorrow and regret. The rose's story unfolded in the darkness, revealing the tale of a princess who had been betrayed by the one she loved most. The rose, the princess whispered, was all that remained of her, a vessel for her heart, bound to the garden for eternity. The shadows around the rose seemed to deepen as it spoke, wrapping Morgatra in their cold embrace. She could feel the weight of the princess's sorrow, her betrayal, her heartbreak. The story lingered in the air, pressing down on her chest, heavy and suffocating. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the rose fell silent. The petals, now fully open, revealed a glowing heart at the center of the bloom, pulsing faintly with an ethereal light. It was as if the rose had shared all it could, bearing its soul for Morgatra to witness. She stared at it, entranced, until the glow began to fade, the petals curling inward once more. The shadows receded, leaving the alcove in stillness once again. Morgatra stood in silence, the weight of the rose's story settling deep within her. The garden held many such tales, she realized, each plant a living testament to a past long forgotten. And now, those stories were hers to uncover. But as she turned to leave the alcove, the ivy twisted back into place behind her, sealing the path. Morgatra's pulse quickened. There was no going back now. The garden was far from finished with her. The mysteries of the garden deepen as Morgatra encounters the first of its enchanted inhabitants, a rose with a heart full of sorrow and betrayal. The garden stories are starting to unfold, but Morgatra is only just beginning to grasp their weight. The black rose had left Morgatra haunted. its story still lingering in her mind like a shadow that refused to be shaken off. The garden was silent again, yet she knew it was not at peace. There were more stories here, stories waiting for her to hear them. And with each step she took, she was becoming more entwined in the garden's strange, enchanted web. She wandered deeper along the winding path, her eyes scanning the plants that surrounded her. Some were familiar, but most were foreign, their shapes strange and twisted, as though touched by some ancient magic. The path twisted and turned, leading her through tunnels formed by overgrown branches and arches of hanging vines. The air was cooler here, damp and thick with the smell of moss and decay. A strange noise broke the silence. It was a soft, almost imperceptible hissing, like the sound of a whisper passed between shadows. Morgathra stopped in her tracks, her heart beginning to race. The noise was coming from ahead, from a cluster of thick, tangled vines that seemed to move ever so slightly. As she watched, the vines writhed, curling around each other like serpents coiling in the underbrush. Cautiously, Morgathra approached. The vines shifted again, revealing a strange plant nestled among them. It was a vine of deep green, its leaves edged with gold, shimmering faintly in the dim light. It was beautiful, but there was something unsettling about the way it moved, as though it were alive in ways a plant should not be. And then it spoke. The voice was not like the soft, sorrowful whisper of the black rose. This voice was low and serpentine, slipping through the air like a secret. "I was once a man," it hissed. "A thief, greedy and foolish." Morgathra froze, her breath catching in her throat. The vine coiled tighter, its golden leaves rustling as it continued its tale. "I came to the garden seeking its treasures, for it was said that the witch who tended it had filled it with riches beyond imagination. But what I found was no gold, no jewels, only these cursed plants, each one more strange and twisted than the last. And when I tried to take what was not mine, the witch found me." Morgathra could feel the vine's energy swirling around her, cold and biting, as the story unfolded. "She was furious," the vine continued, its voice growing darker. Her eyes burned with a light so fierce it scorched the earth where she stood. "And then she laid her curse upon me. I would never leave this garden. My body would twist and change, my soul bound to this vine, forever trapped in the very thing I sought to steal." The vine shifted again, its golden leaves brushing against Morgathra's skin like cold fingers. "For centuries, I have waited here, watching as others came and went, their fates no kinder than mine. Some were turned to stone, others lost themselves in the maze of the garden, never to be seen again. And still, I remain." Morgathra's heart pounded in her chest. The weight of the thief's curse pressed heavily on her, a reminder of the danger that lurked within this enchanted place. She wanted to move, to pull away from the vine's cold grasp. but she found herself rooted to the spot, unable to look away from the twisting coils. The thief's voice softened, almost wistful now. This garden, it holds us all. It keeps our stories, our sins, our sorrows. We are the garden's prisoners, bound by the witch's magic. And so, we wait. Morgathra swallowed hard, her pulse quickening. Wait for what? The vine's golden leaves shimmered faintly, a ghostly light illuminating the deep shadows of the garden. We wait for release, it whispered, its voice barely audible now, carried on the faintest breath of wind. But there is no release. There never will be. The vine fell silent, its golden leaves curling inward once more, retreating into the shadows. Morgathra stood there for a long moment, the thief's story echoing in her mind. She had known, of course, that the garden was no ordinary place, but now the truth of it began to sink in. The garden wasn't just enchanted, it was a prison. Each plant, each flower, each vine held a story, a soul trapped within its twisted branches. As Morgathra turned to leave the vine behind, she felt the weight of their eyes upon her. Eyes she couldn't see but could sense, watching her from the shadows. She had thought she was alone here, but now she knew the truth. The garden was full of lives once lived, and they were all waiting, just as the vine had said, waiting for her. Morgathra uncovers the tale of a cursed thief, now trapped in the form of a vine, whose greed led him to a fate worse than death. The garden's dark magic grows ever clearer, its inhabitants bound to their own stories, forever whispering their fates. Morgathra is left to wonder what other secrets this garden holds, and whether she too will become a part of it. The deeper Morgathra ventured, the more the garden seemed to change. The once gentle glow of the plants began to darken, the light dimming to a soft, eerie luminescence that cast long, strange shadows across the winding path. The trees now stood taller, their branches curling and gnarled like twisted arms, and the air had grown thick and heavy, as though weighed down by centuries of untold stories. Morgathra's thoughts were haunted by the voices she had heard, the sorrow of the rose, the bitterness of the vine. Each story had wrapped itself around her mind like a creeping fog, impossible to shake off. The garden was not just alive, it was sentient, and each plant carried the memory of those who had come before, trapped in an eternal cycle of life and death. And she was part of it now. As she moved deeper into the heart of the garden, a low hissing sound slithered through the air, sending a chill down her spine. It was not the wind, no. This sound was sharper, more menacing, like the hiss of a creature watching from the shadows. Morgathra slowed her pace, her eyes scanning the dense foliage for the source of the noise. Her breath came in shallow, uneven gasps, her pulse quickening with each step. And then she saw it. Coiled around a massive tree at the edge of the path was a vine, thick and sinuous, its surface glistening with a strange golden sheen. The vine twisted and writhed in the faint light, its movements unnatural, deliberate. It was alive, more so than any other plant she had encountered in the garden. As she watched, it began to uncoil, slithering down the trunk of the tree like a serpent, its golden leaves catching the light in flashes of brilliance. Morgatra froze, her heart thudding in her chest. The vine moved with a grace that was almost hypnotic, its length stretching across the ground, leaving faint patterns in the dirt as it wound toward her. It moved closer, and she could feel the weight of its gaze. Though it had no eyes, she knew it was watching her, sensing her presence. The vine hissed again, a sound that sent a shiver down her spine. And then, to her horror, it spoke. "You have come far," the vine hissed, its voice low and venomous, like the whisper of a snake coiling around its prey. "Few venture this deep into the garden. Fewer still survive." Morgathra's throat tightened, but she forced herself to stand her ground. "What are you?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper, though she already knew the answer. This vine, too, held a story, another soul trapped by the garden's curse. The vine's golden leaves shimmered, curling and twisting as it spoke. "I was once a man who sought power, wealth, and control. I thought myself clever, invincible, but I was nothing more than a fool." The vine's voice grew darker, filled with a venomous bitterness. "I came to this garden to steal its secrets. I believed I could take its magic for myself, bend it to my will. But the witch, she saw through me. She saw my greed, my ambition, and she cursed me." Morgathra felt the weight of the vine's gaze, its presence wrapping around her like a shroud. "She transformed me into this," it hissed, the leaves trembling with fury. "A serpent's vine, bound to the earth, to slither and coil in the shadows for all eternity. My soul twisted, just as I twisted others in life." The vine lashed out, its golden tendrils whipping through the air, but Morgathra did not flinch. She could feel its anger, its desire for revenge, but beneath it she sensed something else. Regret, deep and suffocating, buried beneath layers of hatred. "Do you know what it is to be trapped?" the vine continued, its voice growing softer, more desperate. "To feel your soul bound to something you can never escape. This garden, it is more than it seems. It is alive, and it holds us all. It holds us in ways we can never break free from." Morgathra's chest tightened. She wanted to turn away, to flee from the vine's poisonous words, but she couldn't. There was something in its voice that called to her, something that whispered of truths she wasn't yet ready to face. The vine coiled around her feet now, its leaves brushing against her skin like the touch of cold fingers. "You have come too far," it whispered. "The garden will not let you leave. It never does." Morgathra stepped back, pulling away from the vine's grasp, her heart pounding in her ears. The serpent's vine hissed one last time, its golden leaves curling inward as it withdrew into the shadows, retreating to the darkness where it had always belonged. As Morgathra turned to leave, the vine's final words lingered in the air, like a curse that could not be undone. We are all prisoners here, bound by our choices, and now you are too. The story of the serpent's vine has been revealed. A tale of greed, ambition, and betrayal, ending in a curse as twisted as the soul it bound. The garden's enchantment grows darker, and Morgathra finds herself drawn deeper into its tangled web, unable to escape the stories that have already claimed her. Morgathra felt the weight of the serpent's vine's words pressing down on her as she wandered deeper into the garden, her thoughts heavy with the tales she had already uncovered. The garden seemed darker now, its mysteries more dangerous, as if the deeper she ventured, the closer she came to some truth she wasn't sure she was ready to face. The path twisted and narrowed, and the plants around her whispered softly, their voices growing fainter, like the last breath of dying souls. The air was colder here, sharper, as though the very essence of the garden had changed. She could feel it, a pulse, a rhythm in the earth beneath her feet, faint but steady, like the heartbeat of something ancient and immense. Ahead, a strange light flickered, dim and ethereal, casting long, wavering shadows across the ground. Morgathra felt her pulse quicken as she moved toward it, drawn once again by the garden's subtle, unspoken call. The light grew brighter as she neared, revealing a small clearing at the center of the garden. In its midst stood a single flower, unlike anything she had ever seen. It bloomed tall and proud, its petals a deep, velvety black, rimmed with shimmering silver. The flower seemed to pulse with its own light, glowing faintly in the dark, its beauty otherworldly and mesmerizing. Morgathra approached cautiously, her breath catching in her throat. The flower was beautiful, but there was something unsettling about it, something too perfect, too still. As she stood before it, the flower seemed to sense her presence, its petals unfurling slowly, deliberately, like a creature waking from a deep slumber. And then, the air around her grew heavy with the scent of midnight. The fragrance was intoxicating, rich and sweet, yet tinged with something darker, something bitter. It filled Morgathra's senses, clouding her mind, and for a moment she felt as though she were drifting between worlds, caught between waking and dreaming. The garden seemed to fade around her, the edges of reality blurring as the flower began to speak. Its voice was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it carried with it the weight of centuries. "I bloom but once," the flower said, its voice like the rustle of silk on a quiet night. "At the stroke of midnight, when the world is at its stillest, I awaken." Morgathra shivered, her eyes locked on the glowing petals. "Who are you?" she asked, though she was not sure she wanted to know the answer. The flower's silver-edged petals quivered as if in laughter. I am the last gift of the witch who made this garden. She planted me here, at its very heart, to guard its secrets. I bloom only when the moon is high, and my light reveals truths that remain hidden in the daylight. Morgathra's heart quickened. The flower's words, like all the stories she had heard in the garden, were heavy with meaning, and she could feel the truth they held brushing against her mind, just out of reach. What secrets? She whispered, her voice barely audible over the soft hum of the garden around her. The flower's glow intensified, casting long shadows across the clearing. The witch's magic runs deep, deeper than you know. She is gone, but her power remains, woven into the very soil, the very roots of this place. It is her magic that binds the souls you have met, binds you now too. Morgathra took a step back, her chest tightening. She had felt it since she entered the garden, the pull, the subtle way the plants seemed to know her, to watch her. But now, the flower's words confirmed what she had feared. The garden wasn't just alive, it was hungry, and it had chosen her. The flower's voice softened, becoming almost soothing, as if it sensed her fear. "Do not be afraid," it said. "The garden is not your enemy. It is a place of stories, of life and death, of beginnings and endings. But it is also a place of choice. Those who came before were bound by their own decisions, their own desires. You too have a choice to make." Morgathra stared at the glowing bloom, her thoughts swirling. The flower's light cast an eerie glow on her skin, and she could feel the weight of its gaze, though it had no eyes. "What choice?" she asked, her voice trembling. The flower's petals curled inward, folding themselves delicately as its light began to dim. "The garden offers both freedom and captivity," it whispered, its voice fading. "You may leave if you choose, but if you stay, the garden will reveal all its secrets. And once you know them, you will never be the same." The flower's light flickered once more, and then, just as suddenly as it had bloomed, it withered, its petals folding in on themselves until they were no more than a shadow in the darkness. The clearing fell silent, and Morgathra stood alone, the weight of the garden's secrets pressing down on her like a shadow that could not be escaped. The choice lay before her, but Morgathra knew that whatever path she took, the garden had already marked her. The midnight bloom reveals the deeper mysteries of the garden and hints at the power that still lingers from the witch who created it. Morgathra is now faced with a choice, one that will change her forever, as the garden's true nature slowly begins to unravel. Morgathra wandered aimlessly, her thoughts clouded with the weight of the midnight bloom's words. The garden felt heavier now, its beauty more ominous, like a painting whose shadows conceal darker truths. She could feel the garden watching her, its vines curling with purpose, its flowers trembling as she passed. It was alive, not just in the way plants breathe and grow, but with something ancient and sentient. Something that waited for her to make a choice she wasn't ready to make. The path ahead narrowed, and Morgathra found herself drawn to a small grove, isolated from the rest of the garden. The trees here were tall and imposing, their trunks blackened and twisted like gnarled hands reaching for the sky. At the center of the grove stood a weeping willow, its branches long and thin, swaying gently despite the stillness of the air. The willow's silver leaves hung like delicate threads, brushing the ground in soft, graceful arcs. But there was something sorrowful about the tree, as though it carried the weight of many years, many secrets, and many losses. Morgathra approached cautiously, her heart heavy with a strange anticipation. The willow seemed different from the other plants she had encountered. There was no malice in it, no hunger. It simply stood, its branches whispering softly in the quiet air, as though it mourned something long gone. And then the willow wept. At first, it was just a sound, barely perceptible, the softest of sobs, carried on the wind like a distant echo. But as Morgathra stepped closer, the sound grew louder, more distinct. The willow's branches trembled, its silver leaves rustling like the shudder of someone in deep, unbearable grief. The tree was crying. Morgathra hesitated, her pulse quickening. She had heard the stories of the rose and the vine, but this was different. The willow's sorrow was palpable, a deep, aching wound that seemed to throb in the very air around it. She could feel it pressing against her chest, tightening her breath. "Who are you?" Morgathra whispered, though she wasn't sure the willow would answer. The tree's sobs softened, and its branches swayed as though reaching toward her. And then a voice, soft broken, rose from the depths of the willow's weeping. "I am the mother who lost her children," the voice said, its tone laced with an unbearable sadness. "I was once a mighty tree, the protector of this garden, its heart and soul. But I could not save them. I could not save the ones I loved most." Morgathra's throat tightened. She could feel the willow's sorrow as if it were her own, a deep, hollow ache that pulsed through her veins. "I was their guardian," the willow continued, its voice trembling. "But the witch came, and with her, darkness followed. She promised us prosperity. She promised us life eternal. But she took more than she gave. She took my children, and one by one they fell. Each one lost to her magic, bound to this place as I am now. I weep for them, for the lives they will never live, for the joy they will never know." Morgathra's heart ached as the willow's story unfolded. She could see it now, in her mind's eye. The garden as it once was, full of life and laughter, children playing among the trees, their laughter echoing through the leaves. And then the darkness, creeping in like a shadow, stealing away that joy, replacing it with silence and sorrow. The witch's magic was not meant for us, the willow said, its voice cracking with emotion. It was meant for her own purposes, her own greed. And now I am bound here, forever mourning, forever weeping for the ones I could not protect. Morgathra reached out, her fingers brushing against one of the willow's branches. It was cold to the touch, but it trembled under her hand, as if it recognized her sympathy, her understanding. "I'm sorry," Morgathra whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry." The willow's branches swayed as though nodding, accepting her words, though it did little to ease its sorrow. "Beware," the willow whispered, its voice fading. "The garden's magic is not what it seems. It binds, it traps, and once it has you, it will never let go. I weep for them, but I weep for you as well. You are not free. You are part of it now." Morgathra's breath caught in her throat as the weight of the willow's words pressed down on her. She had felt it, the pull, the way the garden seemed to cling to her, as though she had become part of its twisted tapestry. She wanted to flee, to escape its grasp, but deep down, she knew it was too late. The willow fell silent, its branches swaying gently in the still air, the soft sound of its weeping fading into the distance. Morgathra stood there for a long moment, her heart heavy with the sorrow of the tree, her mind spinning with the truth it had revealed. She was part of the garden now, and there was no escape. The cry of the willow reveals the sorrowful tale of a once mighty tree, now bound to the garden by a witch's curse, forever mourning the loss of its children. Morgathra's journey into the garden grows darker as she realizes that the garden's magic holds her as tightly as it holds the souls within it, and the weight of the garden's secrets begins to press upon her more heavily than ever before. Morgathra left the weeping willow behind, but its sorrow clung to her like a mist. Each step felt heavier, the weight of the garden's many stories pressing down on her, making her feel as though she was sinking deeper into its grasp. The garden had become a labyrinth, each twist in the path leading her further from any hope of escape. Yet something urged her on, pulling her toward the heart of the garden, toward the truth she both feared and needed to understand. The path narrowed once more, this time flanked by thick hedges of thorned vines. The thorns were long and sharp, glinting faintly in the dim silvery light that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. The air here was colder, more oppressive, as if the very plants themselves were watching, waiting for her to pass. As Morgathra moved cautiously through the narrow passage, she felt a strange tension in the air. The vines shifted slightly, their thorns scraping against each other with a soft, metallic whisper. She had the distinct feeling that the garden was alive in a way that went beyond simple enchantment. There was intent in every movement, every tremble of the leaves. And then she saw it, a small clearing just beyond the thicket of thorns, a space bathed in an eerie, otherworldly glow. At the center stood a massive twisted tree, its bark dark and gnarled, covered in deep scars that ran like veins across its surface. But what drew Mugathra's attention were the thorns, long, black and gleaming, growing from the tree's branches like jagged spears. The thorns curled and twisted, forming a crown of barbs around the tree's trunk, as though the tree had armored itself against the world. Mugathra hesitated, her pulse quickening. She could feel the tree's presence, ancient and powerful, its energy radiating outward in waves. The air around it crackled with magic, thick and heavy, like the charged air before a storm. She knew without a doubt that this tree held another story, another secret that the garden had kept hidden for too long. Slowly, she stepped into the clearing, her eyes fixed on the twisted tree. The ground beneath her feet was hard, almost brittle, as though nothing had grown here in many years. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint rustle of the thorned branches swaying in the still air. As she neared the tree, the thorns seemed to twitch, their sharp points glistening menacingly in the strange light. And then the tree spoke. "You have come to hear my tale, have you not?" The voice was low, rough, like the grinding of stone against stone. It rumbled through the air, vibrating in Mugathra's chest, filling the clearing with its ancient, weary weight. "Yes," Mugathra whispered, though her throat felt dry and her heart pounded in her chest. "I've come to listen." The tree's branches creaked, the thorns shifting like restless creatures. "I was once a king," the tree began, its voice thick with bitterness. "A king who ruled over a land rich with beauty, a land of prosperity and peace. But I was a fool. I sought power beyond my reach, and in my greed, I sought out the witch who lived in this garden." Mugathra's breath caught in her throat. Another soul, bound by the witch's magic. Another victim of the garden's dark enchantments. The pattern was all too clear now. "I thought I could control her magic," the tree continued, its voice growing darker, more venomous. "I thought I could wield the power of the garden for myself. But the witch saw through me. She saw the darkness in my heart, the ambition that would destroy not only me but my kingdom. And so she cursed me." The thorns shivered, rattling like chains in the wind. "She bound me to this tree, twisted my soul into these thorns. I am trapped here, forever guarding the garden I sought to control. And with every passing year, the thorns grow sharper, more dangerous, a reflection of the cruelty that once lived within me." Mugathra felt a shiver run down her spine. The king's voice was filled with regret, but also with a lingering bitterness, as though the curse had not only trapped him but twisted his very soul. She could feel the weight of his anger, his sorrow, his guilt, all bound to the thorns that curled and twisted around the tree's trunk. "What do you want from me?" Morgathra asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. The tree's branches swayed, the thorns clicking together like the grinding of bones. "I want nothing from you," the tree said, its voice heavy with despair. "But beware, girl. The garden feeds on souls like yours. It will offer you power. It will offer you knowledge. But in the end, it will take from you more than you are willing to give. I was a king, and now I am nothing more than a thorn in the witch's garden." Morgathra stood in silence, the weight of the tree's words pressing down on her. The garden was a prison, not just for those trapped within its twisted vines, but for anyone who dared to seek its power. She could feel the garden's pull, its dark magic winding around her like the thorned branches of the tree, binding her to its secrets. With a final low creak, the tree fell silent, its thorns still gleaming in the dim light. Morgathra turned away, her heart heavy, her mind swirling with the story she had uncovered. The garden had more to reveal. She could feel it just beyond the edge of her understanding. But with every step, the choice became clearer, and the path ahead more dangerous. The thorn's secret reveals the tragic tale of a king whose ambition led to his eternal entrapment as a guardian of the garden's dark magic. Morgathra is left to grapple with the growing realization that the garden's power comes at a terrible price, and she must decide whether she will continue to seek its secrets or find a way to escape before it is too late. The sky above the garden had darkened. The faint silver glow that once bathed the plants fading into an unnatural twilight. Morgathra could feel the garden shifting around her, its whispers growing louder, more insistent. The air was thick with the weight of unseen forces, and the stories she had uncovered. The rose, the vine, the willow and the thorn now felt like echoes of a much larger truth. There was something more here, something deeper, and she was drawing ever closer to it. As she continued along the winding path, the garden seemed to close in on her. The once wide expanses of strange flowers and twisted trees now replaced by narrow corridors of vines and shadow. The plants seemed to pulse with life, their movements slow and deliberate, as though they were breathing, waiting. The ground beneath her feet felt colder now, harder, and with each step, Morgathra knew that she was nearing the heart of the garden. A faint light appeared ahead, flickering like a candle struggling to stay lit. The path opened up into a small, circular clearing, and at its center stood an ancient stone altar, overgrown with ivy and darkened by time. Surrounding the altar, barely visible in the dim light, were twisted statues, figures frozen in poses of agony, their faces contorted with fear and despair. Their stone hands reached toward the sky as if pleading for mercy that would never come. Morgathra's breath caught in her throat. She felt the weight of the garden's magic pressing down on her, heavier now than ever before. The clearing was silent, save for the faint rustle of the wind through the ivy. But it felt as though the very air was vibrating with unseen energy. And then she saw her. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, half hidden in shadow. Her silhouette was tall and gaunt, her cloak blending into the darkness around her. Her presence was overwhelming, a force that seemed to bend the very space around her. As she stepped into the light, her eyes gleamed with a cold, otherworldly glow. And Morgothra knew, without a doubt, that this was the witch who had created the garden, who had cursed it. The witch had returned. Morgothra's heart pounded in her chest, her pulse quickening with fear and something else. An irresistible pull, a fascination with the dark power that radiated from the woman before her. "You've wandered far, child," the witch said, her voice smooth and cold, like the surface of a frozen lake. She moved toward Morgothra with slow, deliberate steps, her presence filling the clearing with an aura of ancient magic. "You've heard their stories. You've seen the price of their choices." Morgothra took a step back, her mind racing. The stories she had uncovered flashed before her eyes. The rose, bound by love and betrayal. The vine, twisted by greed. The willow, mourning the loss of its children. The thorn, a king's ambition turned to torment. And now, standing before her, was the source of it all. "What do you want from me?" Morgothra asked, her voice trembling, though she tried to keep it steady. The witch's lips curled into a faint smile, but it held no warmth, only a cold amusement. "The garden chooses," she said softly. "It always chooses, and it has chosen you." Morgothra's stomach twisted. "Chosen me for what?" The witch's eyes gleamed in the faint light, her gaze piercing through Morgothra as if seeing into the very depths of her soul. "To continue the cycle," she whispered. "To take your place among the stories you've so eagerly sought to understand. The garden thrives on the souls of those who seek its secrets. And you, child, are no different." Morgothra's chest tightened, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The garden had lured her here, fed her the stories of the souls trapped within its twisted branches. But now she realized the full weight of what it wanted. It wanted her. She took another step back, her mind spinning. "I didn't come here to be trapped," she said, her voice rising. "I came here to understand." The witch's smile faded, replaced by a cold, impassive stare. "Understanding comes at a cost. Everything in this garden does." Morgothra shook her head, her heart racing. She could feel the garden's pull, stronger now than ever before, its dark magic wrapping around her like invisible vines. The stories she had uncovered weren't just tales. They were warnings. And now she stood on the edge of becoming another one, another soul bound to the garden's twisted will. "No," Morgathra whispered, her voice barely audible. "I won't stay." The witch raised an eyebrow, her gaze sharp as a blade. "Won't you?" she asked softly, her voice carrying the weight of centuries. "The garden has already claimed you, child. There is no leaving." Morgathra's breath hitched. The ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble, the very air around her thickening with magic. She could feel it now, the garden's hunger, its desire to consume her, to turn her into another story to be whispered in the wind. But somewhere deep within her, a spark of defiance flared. "I'll find a way," Morgathra said, her voice stronger now, though her heart still pounded with fear. "I won't let you take me." The witch's eyes narrowed, and for a moment the air grew colder, the shadows deepening. But then she smiled. A smile that was neither kind nor cruel, but simply knowing. "We shall see," she whispered. And with that, the witch faded into the shadows, leaving Morgathra standing alone in the clearing, her heart racing, her mind swirling with the weight of the garden's dark magic. The witch's return brings Morgathra face to face with the garden's creator, revealing the terrible truth of the garden's nature and the price it demands. As the final choice looms, Morgathra must confront the power that seeks to claim her, knowing that escape may no longer be an option. The garden's secrets have been laid bare, but at what cost?